The weight of the silver tray was a familiar ache in her wrist, a grounding pressure against the panic fluttering in her throat. 3 plates, each a constellation of seared scallops and saffron risotto, sent steam ghosting into the chilled air of the restaurant. Alara kept her eyes down. Her focus narrowed to the polished tips of her own black shoes as she navigated the maze of tables. Just another order. Just another table. But it was not just another table. She had known it from the moment she took the order. The other patrons gave them a wide berth, their laughter and conversation shrinking as if sucked into the vacuum of silence that surrounded the 4 men in the corner booth. The air there was different, colder, heavier. The man at the head of the table wore a suit so dark it seemed to drink the low light of the restaurant. He had not looked at the menu. He had not spoken to her. He had simply watched, his stillness a physical force, while the man to his right ordered for everyone. Now, as she approached, she could feel his gaze on her, a tangible touch that traced the line of her neck, the tremble in her hands. She told herself it was just a rich man's arrogance. She had served plenty of those. However, when she leaned in to place the first plate, his hand moved, not fast, but with an unnerving deliberation. His fingers, long and blunt, closed around her wrist, stopping her. The tray tilted. The heat of the plates was a sudden, searing threat against her forearm. The man's touch was not rough, but it was absolute. A cage of flesh and bone. The silver ring on his pinky was cold against her skin. "You're new," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low rumble, smoke and gravel. Alara's breath hitched. She could feel every eye in the restaurant turning toward them, a wave of unwelcome attention. Her manager, a nervous man named Julian, was already hovering near the kitchen door, his face pale. "My apologies, sir. Is something wrong?" she managed, her voice a thin thread. He did not answer. He simply held her there, his thumb stroking the frantic pulse at her wrist. His eyes, the color of dark, aged whiskey, finally lifted to meet hers. They were utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a predator assessing its prey, not with hunger, but with a cold, detached curiosity. In that moment she understood. This was not about the food. This was not about the service. This was about him. And now, for some reason she could not comprehend, it was about her. She was locked in his sights, and she had the terrifying certainty that he would not let her go. "Let's see," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the plate she had been about to set down. He released her wrist as abruptly as he had taken it. The sudden freedom was dizzying. She quickly placed the plate before him, her hands shaking so badly she was surprised she didn't drop it. She served the other 3 men, their faces impassive masks, their own stillness a reflection of their leaders. She retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to busy herself at the service station, polishing silverware that was already gleaming, but his presence burned a hole in the corner of her vision. She could feel him watching her every move. The meal progressed in that same unnerving silence. He ate little, his attention seemingly fixed on the swirl of wine in his glass. When the plates were cleared, he summoned Julian with a subtle lift of his chin. Alara watched from a distance as her manager approached the table, his posture a study in deference. The man, she had heard one of his companions call him Dante, spoke in that same low, controlled voice. Julian nodded, his face growing paler with each word. Finally, Julian turned and walked directly to her, his expression grim. "He wants to see you." "Me? Why?" The question was a whisper. "Just go, Alara. Don't argue. Just be agreeable." Her legs felt like lead as she walked back to the table. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne, a mix of cedar and something else, something sharp and metallic like cold steel. She stood beside the booth, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. Dante looked up at her, a long, slow appraisal that made her feel stripped bare. "Your manager tells me you are a diligent employee, punctual, quiet." She swallowed. "I try to be, sir." You served the wine from the right, he stated. You cleared from the left. Your posture is correct. You did not interrupt, he paused, letting the silence stretch. But you are afraid. Her eyes darted to his, startled. I can smell it, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, meant for her alone. It ruins the appetite. It sours the wine. He leaned forward slightly, the movement precise and menacing. This is my table. In my city. When you are at my table, I expect perfection. And fear is an imperfection. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. He was dissecting her, not as an employee, but as a person, finding her wanting in front of his silent, watchful men. It was a calculated cruelty, a display of power for an audience of 3. He was breaking her down piece by piece simply because he could. I apologize, sir, she stammered, her gaze fixed on the knot of his silk tie. Do not apologize for what you are, he said, the words cutting deeper than any shout. Simply remove it from my presence. He waved a dismissive hand. You are done for the night. She fled. She did not look at Julian, did not wait for him to officially dismiss her. She walked straight to the staff locker room, her body trembling with a mixture of shame and rage. She changed out of her uniform with fumbling fingers, pulling on her simple jeans and worn coat. The night air was a cold shock against her heated skin as she pushed through the back door into the alley. She just wanted to go home, to hide in her tiny apartment and forget the cold weight of that man's eyes. She hurried down the narrow alley, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the damp brick walls. She was almost at the street when a long, black car slid to a silent stop, blocking her path. The back door opened. Dante stepped out. He stood there, silhouetted against the distant streetlights, a figure of absolute authority. He had shed the pretense of the restaurant patron. This was who he was, a man who owned the shadows. I did not dismiss you, he said. Alara's blood ran cold. You said I was done for the night. You were done serving me at that table, he corrected, stepping toward her. The alley seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. Your employment there is terminated. You work for me now. The words made no sense. Work for you? Doing what? I'm a waitress. You are what I say you are, he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. He stopped a mere foot from her, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The sheer physical reality of him was overwhelming. He was taller, broader than he had seemed sitting down. A wall of tailored wool and unyielding will. You have an interesting quality, Alara. Most people, when I apply pressure, they shatter. They cry. They beg. You just stand there. You absorb it. You have a stillness I find useful. She stared at him, her mind reeling. This was insane. It was a nightmare. I don't want to work for you. I have a job. I had a job. A flicker of something. Amusement, maybe, though it never reached his eyes, crossed his face. You think you have a choice, he reached out, not to grab her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so shockingly intimate, so possessive. It stole the air from her lungs. His fingers brushed the shell of her ear, and a tremor went through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a terrifying, unwelcome awareness. Get in the car. She thought she had survived the worst of it, the public humiliation. She thought she could escape, lick her wounds and move on. But that was her mistake. The humiliation was not the end. It was the beginning. It was a test, and in his cold, predatory world, she had somehow passed. Now, a door had closed behind her, the one leading back to her simple, quiet life, and the one opening before her led straight into the darkness he commanded. The car was a silent, leather-lined tomb. It moved through the city with an impossible smoothness, insulating them from the noise and the lights. Alara sat pressed against the far door, her muscles coiled tight. Dante sat opposite her, not looking at her, his attention on the rain-streaked window. He seemed to be occupying a different space entirely, one defined by thought and shadow. They drove for what felt like an hour, leaving the familiar grid of Manhattan behind and crossing a bridge into the deeper, quieter parts of the city. They pulled up to a high stone wall, and iron gates glided open without a sound. The car crunched over a gravel drive and stopped before a house that was less a home and more a fortress of dark stone and ivy. A man opened Dante's door. Another opened hers. There were no questions, no instructions. She was simply expected to follow. The inside of the house was opulent but cold. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, and ceilings so high they seemed to swallow the light from the crystal chandeliers. It was silent, not peaceful, but the heavy, waiting silence of a place where violence was always a possibility. Dante led her into a vast library. Bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked untouched. He walked to a large mahogany desk and gestured to a single, straight-back chair placed in front of it. "Sit." She sat. Her coat felt shabby and out of place in the cavern of wealth. He remained standing, looming over her. "From now on, you will live here. You will serve my meals. You will be present when I have guests. You will do exactly as you are told. You will see nothing and you will say nothing. In return, you will be provided for." "Provided for? I don't want to be provided for. I want to go home." "This is your home now," he said, the finality in his tone like a coffin lid closing. He walked around the desk and sat, the large leather chair sighing under his weight. He steepled his fingers, his whiskey-colored eyes fixed on her. "I have a meeting. You will bring coffee. Black. 2 sugars." He pressed a button on an intercom she hadn't noticed. A moment later, a severe-looking woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun entered the room. "This is Maria. She runs the household. She will show you to your room and where to find the kitchen. Do not disappoint me, Alara." It was a dismissal. Maria's grip on her arm was firm as she led Alara from the library. Her room was small but comfortable, with a plain bed and a single window overlooking a manicured, shadowed garden. Felt like a cell, a gilded cage. For days, that was her life. She woke before dawn. She prepared Dante's coffee. She served his meals in a cavernous dining room where he always ate alone, his silence a suffocating blanket. She was a ghost in his house, her presence required but never acknowledged. He looked through her as if she were made of glass. The intense focus he'd had on her at the restaurant was gone, replaced by a chilling indifference. The humiliation had been personal. This was worse. This was erasure. She learned to read the rhythms of the house. She learned which men were his inner circle, their faces hard, their loyalty to him absolute. She learned to recognize the tension that preceded a late-night meeting, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that meant trouble was brewing. One evening, she was serving him and his underboss, a man named Marco, in the library. They were speaking in low, tense tones. She moved silently, refilling their glasses, her training as a waitress making her invisible. "It was Sal," Marco said, his voice tight, "the shipment from the docks. He sold the information to the Albanians." Dante's face was carved from stone. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his expression unreadable. "Salvatore was my brother's man. He vouched for him." "Your brother made mistakes," Marco said carefully. A flicker. It was so small, so brief, Alara would have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so closely. For a fraction of a second, the mask of cold control slipped, and what lay beneath was a chasm of raw, unguarded pain. It was the wound he carried, a failure, a betrayal tied to a brother he had lost. The casual cruelty he'd shown her in the restaurant suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He tested for weakness in others because he could not tolerate it in himself or in the memory of those he was supposed to protect. The moment passed. The mask was back in place. "Find Salvatore," Dante ordered, his voice flat and cold. "Bring him to me." Just as Marco stood to leave, the world exploded. The tall library windows shattered inward, spraying glass across the room. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire ripped through the heavy silence of the house. Instinct took over. Alara dropped the tray and dove behind a heavy velvet curtain. Marco was already moving, pulling a weapon from his jacket and shoving Dante toward the desk. The room was chaos, bullets tearing into the priceless books, splintering the mahogany desk. From her hiding place, Alara could see two men in dark clothes climbing through the broken window. Marco was providing cover fire, but Dante was exposed, momentarily trapped between the desk and the wall. One of the intruders was raising his weapon, taking aim. There was no time to think. Beside her, stacked against the wall, were several heavy crates of what looked like wine. Her mind went blank, her body moving on pure adrenaline. She shoved the top crate with all her might, toppled with a tremendous crash, taking the others with it. Bottles shattered, wine and glass spraying across the floor. The sound was the only diversion needed. The gunman flinched, his head turning toward the noise for a single, fatal second. It was all the time Dante needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion. In 2 strides he was on the man, his movements economical and lethal. Marco took care of the second intruder. Silence descended, thick and ringing. It was filled with the smell of cordite and spilled wine. Alara was trembling, her back pressed against the wall, the heavy curtains still clutched in her hand. The library was destroyed, and in the center of the destruction, Dante stood, breathing heavily, his suit immaculate save for a splash of red wine on his sleeve. He turned his head, and his eyes found her. They locked, and the world seemed to fall away. There was no indifference in his gaze now. There was something else, something raw and elemental. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the broken glass crunching under his expensive shoes. He reached into her hiding place, his hand closing around her upper arm, and pulled her out into the ruined room. He hauled her against him, his body a shield, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her head. He pressed her face into his shoulder, blocking her view of the carnage. His heart hammered against her cheek, a frantic, powerful rhythm. His scent, cedar, steel, and now gunpowder, filled her senses. She could have run in the chaos. She had a clear path to the door while they were fighting. But she had stayed. She had acted. And he knew it. "You're mine," he breathed into her hair, the words a rough, possessive claim. It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was a statement of fact, a branding. Because she had saved him, he no longer saw her as a servant to be ignored. Therefore, she became something else, problem to be contained, a variable to be controlled. He moved her from the small staff room to a suite of rooms adjoining his own. The pretense of her being an employee was gone. She was now his prisoner, under his constant, suffocating watch. The days that followed were a new kind of hell, a silent, tense proximity that was more intimate than any touch. She saw him at his most unguarded. She saw the exhaustion behind his eyes after a long night of meetings. She saw the way his hand would sometimes clench, a barely perceptible tremor when he thought no one was watching. She saw the man, not just the monster, and that was far more dangerous. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered the quiet halls of the house. A light was on in the library, which had been meticulously cleaned and repaired, the shattered windows replaced. She hesitated at the door. He was at his desk, a ledger open before him, his focus so absolute he did not notice her. Drawn by a curiosity she knew was reckless, she crept closer. She could see the columns of names and numbers. It was a ledger of debts, not of money, but of loyalty and blood. It detailed the cold, brutal architecture of his empire. One entry caught her eye. A name, Antonio Gallo, was circled in red. Beside it was a notation, traitor. Final payment due. Her stomach turned. This was the reality of his world, stripped of its fine suits and expensive wine. This was the cost. The next day, the house was thick with a new tension. Antonio Gallo, a capo with a kind face she had seen at the house before, was brought before Dante. Alara was instructed to bring a tray of water, an order she knew was a test of her nerve. She entered the library to find Gallo on his knees, Marco and 2 other guards standing over him. You betrayed this family, Antonio? Dante said, his voice deceptively calm. You spoke with the Federale. You sold us out for a promise of immunity. It's not true, Dante, Gallo pleaded, his face slick with sweat. I swear on my mother's grave. Someone is setting me up. Dante looked at Marco, who gave a slight, grim nod. The verdict was already decided. Her mind raced back to the ledger. She remembered another name on the same page, one with a series of coded transactions next to it that didn't add up. It was Marco. She had a choice. Say nothing, and let a man she believed to be innocent die. Or speak, and reveal she had spied on Dante, an act that would surely mean her own death. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense silence. His accounts are clean. Every head in the room snapped toward her. Dante's eyes narrowed, becoming dangerous slits of obsidian. What did you say? She forced herself to meet his gaze, her heart pounding. She had to be clever. Last night, sir, when I brought your coffee, you had the books open. I overheard you and Marco discussing the accounts. You said Antonio's were clean, but that there were discrepancies elsewhere. I must have misheard. It was a lie, a desperate gamble. She was using her quiet, observant nature, the very thing he'd said he found useful, as her shield. She was offering him a way out, a reason to look again without him losing face. Marco's face went rigid. He knew what she was doing. Dante stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched for an eternity. He was dissecting her lie, weighing her motives. He was looking for the fear he had accused her of before, but she refused to give it to him. She held his gaze, her expression one of polite, feigned confusion. Finally, he turned his head slowly to look at Marco. Is this true? Were there other discrepancies? Marco hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Dante, the evidence against him is clear. That was not my question, Dante said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Bring me the books. All of them. Later that night, he came to her room. He did not knock. The door swung open and he was there, filling the frame. He closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing like a gunshot. He advanced on her until her back was against the cold glass of the window. He placed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. His face was inches from hers, his expression dark and intense. You lied, he said softly. She did not deny it. Yes. Why? Because you were about to make a mistake, she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. You were about to kill a loyal man and let a traitor walk free. He stared at her, his whiskey eyes searching hers. She expected rage, violence. Instead, she saw a flicker of something she could not name, a grudging respect, a crack in the marble facade. My brother made mistakes, he said, the admission torn from him, a confession of his deepest fear. I do not. He did not touch her. He just stood there, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, his breath ghosting across her cheek. The space between them crackled with a tension that was no longer just fear on her part or dominance on his. It was something new, something shared, a dangerous, unspoken understanding. In his world, she was the only one who had ever seen his fallibility and offered him a way to keep his strength. She thought in that moment that she had earned something, a sliver of trust, a place of strange, precarious safety in his violent world. But she had only traded one danger for another. By saving Antonio Gallo, she had made a powerful enemy. Marco now knew she was not just an insignificant waitress. She was a threat, and in Dante's world, threats were not tolerated. They were eliminated. The attack came not with the roar of gunfire, but in silence. She was in the garden, the one place she felt a semblance of peace, when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and a sharp sting in her neck sent the world spiraling into darkness. She woke to the damp, musty smell of a cellar. Her hands were tied behind her, her head throbbed. Marco stood over her, his face twisted into a sneer. The boss has a soft spot for his little stray, he said. He listens to you. Fatal error. He's on his way now, walking into a trap, all to save the quiet little waitress who saw too much. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Dante was coming for her, and he was going to die. You won't win, she said, her voice hoarse. He'll see it. He sees. She looked at Marco, at the expensive watch on his wrist, the pride he took in his appearance. He knows it was you, she said, her voice gaining strength. He's known for weeks. This isn't a trap for him. It's for you. He's just letting you think you're in control before he takes everything. Marco's smile faltered. Lies. Is it? She pressed, pushing herself up to a sitting position. Why else would he trust me? He put me next to him to watch you. He knew you'd make a move. He told me you were ambitious but sloppy, that you wore your greed like cheap cologne. Doubt flickered in his eyes. She saw it. It was the opening she needed. While he was processing her words, his focus momentarily fractured. She worked her wrists against the rough rope. She was not strong, but she was desperate. The cellar door crashed open. Dante stood there, a silhouette of righteous fury. But Marco was ready, his gun already up, aimed not at Dante, but at her. One more step and she dies, Marco snarled. But Alara was not waiting to be rescued. In that split second, she surged forward, throwing her entire body weight into Marco's knees. He stumbled, his shot going wide, shattering a crate on the far wall. The move was clumsy, desperate, but it was enough. Dante moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a blur of violence and purpose. It was over in seconds. Marco lay on the floor, and Dante stood over him, his chest heaving. Then he turned to her. He crossed the cellar, pulling her to her feet, his grip on her arms bruising. He searched her face, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, wild emotion she had never seen before. It wasn't relief. It was rage. Pure, undiluted rage directed at himself. You were never to be a target, he said, the words ripped from his throat. This was my failure. He held her there, his knuckles white. It was the closest he would ever come to saying he cared. It was an admission that she had become his vulnerability, the one variable he could not control, the one person whose loss would be a mistake he could not bear. He took her back to the house, back to the penthouse suite that overlooked the glittering, indifferent city. The cost of her survival was the last shred of her old life. She was no longer Alara, the shy waitress. She was Dante Moretti's weakness, and the entire underworld would now know it. His cost was even greater. For the first time, he had won. He stood behind her as she looked out the vast window, the city lights a galaxy at their feet. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a brand on her skin, a permanent weight in the air around her. They will all know who you are now, he said. The words were not a threat. They were a vow, a statement of absolute, irrevocable ownership. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. The face staring back was pale and tired, but the eyes were different. They were no longer the downcast eyes of a shy girl trying to be invisible. They were clear. They were steady. They had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. She saw the woman who had been humiliated by Dante Moretti, and then had, in her own quiet way, broken through his defenses. He thought he had claimed her, but in the silence of that room, with the city sprawling beneath them, she made a choice. She would not be his weakness. She would be his stillness, his counsel, the one person who saw the cracks in his armor and did not try to shatter it, but instead showed him where they were so he could not be broken by anyone else. She did not look away from her reflection. She met her own gaze, and for the first time since that night in the restaurant, she felt no fear. She stayed.